Traffic. Traffic. Descend. Descend now.
In September 2006, a major incident has occurred in the sky over France. This is the untold tale of Flight 6074 on EasyJet. An EasyJet Airbus A319 with 138 passengers and 6 crew members departed from Alicante, Spain, early on September 15, 2006. They had 2.5 hours to go to Bristol in the United Kingdom. A large number of the passengers were vacationing Britons returning home after spending a few days basking in the Spanish heat. In Europe, summer travel was drawing to a conclusion, and the sky were starting to clear up a little. However, EasyJet was only getting started. This A319 was among the brand new planes they had purchased from Airbus. The whole fleet of the aircraft had previously consisted of less fuel-efficient Boeing 737s, which would eventually be replaced by these cutting-edge vehicles. For both the low-cost carrier and the pilots that flew for it, it was an exciting time. But in the middle of all this technical advancement, there was a secret threat. This was a brand new airplane, and the pilots in front of the cockpit were inexperienced with it as well. The 42-year-old captain had flown about 9,000 hours on Airbus aircraft, but only about 400 of those hours were on the type of aircraft. The majority of his encounters had been constructed on the Boeing 737, with somewhat more than 3,000 hours of total flying time. The first officer had less experience than the captain. Like the captain, though, he only flew 500 hours or so on Airbus aircraft for a minor amount of this time. Miles above the French countryside, these pilots would encounter a horrific emergency in a matter of moments. Their advanced aircraft would malfunction in a manner beyond their training. The pilots had switched places with the crew that had flown the jet in just before they boarded the aircraft at Alicante. They had been informed by the flight's captain of an issue with one of the electrical generators in the aircraft. Numerous systems inside the aircraft were powered by this generator, which was run by the left engine. It'd have to be switched off for the Bristol flight. But this issue was not considered significant enough to cause the plane to be delayed in Alicante. The right-hand engine of the aircraft powered a second electrical generator. Furthermore, it may potentially use energy from the plane's auxiliary power unit, or APU, a tiny engine located in the tail. As in order to offer an extra degree of safety, the pilots of this aircraft would have to run the APU the entire distance. The plane to Bristol was ready to take off at 10 minutes after 11 local time. The plane was loaded with 8,000 kilograms of gasoline for the journey. The passengers had boarded, and the luggage had been unloaded. Flight 6074 moved back from the gate as the flight attendants closed the doors. The passengers were unaware that there was a serious flaw with their aircraft. The pilots were aware that something was wrong, but they didn't realize how serious it was. The captain aligned the aircraft with runway 28 and started the engines for takeoff thrust at 25 minutes after 11 in the morning. As the airplane took off, it operated flawlessly. After pointing the aircraft north, the captain increased altitude to 32,000 feet. This seemed, on the surface, to be a fairly typical flight. The flight attendants served food and drinks throughout the cabin as the aircraft cruised, and the pilots kept an eye on the aircraft systems. However, all of this abruptly changed an hour and a half after departure, when the plane soared high above the French countryside. The pilots heard a loud clang without warning. All of the captain's instruments suddenly went dead. The moment the autopilot disconnected, the master warning alert went off. The captain immediately gave the first officer, whose instruments were still operational, control of the ship. With no computerized safety features to keep the airplane safe, he was now operating it manually. His left hand was on the push levers, and his right hand was gripping the side stick. Now, the first officer's whole focus was on operating the aircraft at nearly the speed of sound, 10 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. The captain, meantime, was rushing to figure out what went wrong. Considering that the APU had been operating since the beginning of the trip, he surmised that it had either malfunctioned or shut down. Whatever had occurred, there were dire repercussions, and the pilots had only recently begun to realize how bad things really were. The captain attempted to inspect the damage, while the first officer piloted the aircraft by looking around the cockpit. The autopilot had disengaged, and he was missing his primary screens. Which other systems might be vulnerable? The radio panel had gone entirely black, as far as he could tell. Its lights were all off, and the windows were showing no frequencies. This was very worrying. How would we communicate without radios? Can the pilots communicate with air traffic control regarding their situation? This cut off flight 6074 from the outside world. The ECAM, one of the few displays in the cockpit that was still operational, showed a checklist, which the captain started to follow. Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor is referred to as ECAM. For the pilots, it's a very helpful tool that lets them keep an eye on every facet of the aircraft's performance. One stage that would fully restore the aircraft's power was to appear on this list. This step called for the captain to switch the ACES feed to the alternate position, allowing the aircraft to draw electricity from a different source. The problem was that just before that item on the list, there was another item that said that the fault light in the associated push button should be illuminated. If it had been illuminated, it would have looked like this. But for some reason, it was off, leaving the captain perplexed. There were a few possible explanations for why this light could be off, including the possibility that the computer just wasn't recognizing the fault and the malfunction indicator. On the other hand, it can indicate that there was not a mistake. But the recent catastrophic failure of the aircraft systems amply disproved this. Alternatively, the captain realized now it was possible that the fault light just didn't have power, just like the majority of the lights on the overhead panel. The captain needed to choose. Is it appropriate for him to flip this switch without knowing if there was a problem? Ultimately, he concluded that his options were limited. He could scarcely make things worse, no matter what he did. After flipping the switch, he waited. However, nothing took place. The push-button button's light stayed out, and the aircraft's electricity never came back on. The peculiar design of this kind of push-button, which is frequently found on many contemporary airplanes from both Boeing and Airbus, added to the pilot's bewilderment in this instance. The button doesn't stay in place once it is pressed. Instead, it merely makes a click before moving back to where it was. The caption light within the button flashes as the only clue that the button has been pressed. This functions perfectly under normal circumstances, but in a scenario like this, where the lights were out of power, the design of the switch made it hard to figure out where any of the switches were located. The pilots were flying blind now, in a way. The pilot had to notify air traffic control because there was no indication that the aircraft's power was coming back on. Although the lights on his radio panel were all off, he reasoned that it might be the case that the radios were still operational despite the lights being off. He turned on the microphone and attempted to use his primary radio set, VHF-1, to send a message to Brest Air Traffic Control. There was no reply. He then attempted to use VHF-2, the second radio set, but once more got no response. This did not bode well. While the captain changed to the international emergency frequency, the first officer continued to operate the aircraft manually. 121, 5% MHZ, and a mayday was issued. Despite trying this frequency on both of his radio sets, he received no response. Subsequently, the first officer attempted to use his radios, but he also received no response. Now alone, and thousands of feet above the French countryside, the pilots had no contact with the outside world. The flight attendants and past news crew behind them had no idea what kind of emergency was occurring on the flight deck. There was no turbulence, since the first officer was flying the plane so smoothly, even with the engine still going. However, there was one little anomaly, which perhaps a few travelers observed. The no smoking signs were turned off on the left side of the airplane. This side's reading lights were likewise off. They most likely wouldn't have seen this, since it's unlikely that any passengers would have been utilizing them throughout the middle of the day. However, it was an indication that there was a significant electrical supply issue with the aircraft as a whole, and particularly with the left side. The pilots were still trying to determine the extent of this situation. However, this did not mean that the pilots were the only ones who sensed a problem. With everything going on 10 kilometers below the aircraft at Brest Area Control Center, the air traffic controller, who had been monitoring Flight 6074, was extremely worried. Suddenly, the flight had vanished from his screen. The controller summoned the pilots on the radio right away, but no one answered. This was very worrying. There was no radio contact and no radar trace. The operator anticipated the worst. He repeatedly attempted to contact the airplane, but he was met with silence each time. He even begged an EasyJet aircraft in his area of influence to use the corporate frequency to contact their other
travelers in a desperate attempt to reach his colleagues. However, the flying crew was also unable to establish communication. This was a passenger plane that had either abruptly gone dark due to a bomb, or worse, had been taken over by force. However, there existed an additional situation that was equally horrifying. The flight was traveling northwest at 32,000 feet when the controller had last spotted it on radar. However, an American Airlines plane was flying from east to west to the north of it. It was also at 32,000 feet and going to coincide with the EasyJet flight that went missing. Less than a minute separated the two aircraft, assuming the EasyJet plane was still in the air. In a panic, the controller called the American Airlines flight and inquired as to if they could see the EasyJet aircraft on their TCAS screen. Traffic Collision and Avoidance System is referred to as TCS. Pilots utilize this onboard technology as a last resort to prevent mid-air crashes. The device will say, "Traffic, traffic," and give the user instructions to either ascend or descend if it senses an impending collision. There's a catch, though. TCS requires that both of the concerned planes have it turned on, and because of the electrical failure on the EasyJet flight, this system was without power. The crew of American Airlines Flight 63 scanned their displays looking for the rogue aircraft, but it was nowhere to be seen. With every second, the two planes were drawing closer together at nearly the speed of sound. For the controller, the tension was unbearable. If these two planes collided, the death toll would be monumental. The controller faced a dilemma. Should he instruct the American Airlines jet to change its altitude, or would it be better to keep it where it was? It all depended on what the EasyJet flight was doing. However, the controller had no idea what the plane was doing because they couldn't see it on radar. He needed to decide quickly. Thus, he gave the American Airlines aircraft the order to drop to 31,000 feet. But at that moment, someone changed shifts at air traffic control. For whatever reason, the controller in charge of the aircraft at this crucial juncture moved away from his workstation and delegated authority to his colleague. The American Airlines plane was still not in the downward position. The pilots continued to scan TCAS and the outside glass for the EasyJet aircraft. Given how urgent this situation is, there was not enough time for the departing controller to fully transfer all of his information to his colleague. The American Airlines plane descended right away, as instructed by the new controller, who was keen to see it do so. At that point, American Airlines Flight 63's pilots started to descend. As the American Airlines plane gradually blinked over his screen, its altitude was now decreasing, and the controller held his breath. The voice on the radio then started. Through their windscreen, the American Airlines flight's pilots had noticed an EasyJet aircraft traveling directly overhead. It was the flight that went missing. There was a great sigh of relief from the controller. It had not been his darkest nightmare. The two planes had actually collided within 19 seconds of each other. However, the struggle was far from ended. It appeared that the EasyJet aircraft was still in the air, so why wasn't it communicating? A hijacking was the possibility that worried the controller the most right now. The pilots back in the cockpit were unaware of this. They were occupied with attempting to solve their communication issues. But still, they shared the controller's concerns on the same situation. It was not that they would be taken over, but rather that the controllers would believe they had. How would the pilots contact the fighter jets if they were being intercepted if they didn't have radio communication? And what if they had to deviate or change direction for any reason? Would they get shot down if they did that? This was a highly stressful scenario for the flight crew of 60 to 74. Here, there was uncertainty on both sides. Everybody was in the dark, following the first officers and captains. There had been no success in contacting air traffic control. As said on the ECOM, the captain proceeded with his actions. Changing from this place's number 1 transponder system to its number 2 transponder system was one of the final tasks on the list. Air traffic control receives the plane's position information from the transponder. When the skipper took this action, the display suddenly came back to life. However, there was still no assurance that the aircraft was genuinely sending out a signal. The numbers had come back, but there were no more lights on the panel. Was it true that someone was home, even if the lights were off? The pilots were clueless. However, the controller was ecstatic to be back in Brest. The EZ-6074 target had come back into view on his screen.
At 32,000 feet, the plane was flying smoothly along its flight path, exactly where it should have been. He used the radio to call the airplane once more, but the pilots had not responded. Once they were back in the cockpit, the crew started talking about what to set their squawk code to. Air traffic control gives the flight an identification code at takeoff so that it can be recognized on their radar screens, apart from other aircraft. This code is known as the squawk code. Back in Alicante, the code had been set at 5376, but the pilots now needed to alter it in light of their emergency. In aviation, 3 emergency codes are utilized, each designating a distinct type of emergency. 7500 is the code for a hijacking, 7700 for a general emergency, and 7600 for a radio breakdown. The pilots concluded that the code for radio failure did not fully describe their circumstances, considering the seriously damaged state of their aircraft. That was not nearly as bad as what had occurred to their jet. They really were in a dire situation. Thus, the skipper pressed ident and entered 7700 into the transponder panel. This appeared on the controller's screen. He was aware that the plane's issue went beyond a simple radio malfunction. However, he was still unaware of the precise nature of the emergency that the pilots were in. Furthermore, he was unaware of their plans for the future. In all honesty, neither did the pilots. They were still adjusting to their new circumstances. The skipper was instructed to try the oldest trick in the book by the following ECAM operation. That involved turning the top generator off and back on. When he did this, he received no reply. The aircraft systems were still off. Furthermore, the captain was unable to determine which position the switch was in without the caption lights functioning. The captain was committed to identifying the issue's origin. In its current state, he and the first officer would have a very difficult time safely bringing the plane down to an airfield. Somehow, they had to get the electricity back. The captain, understandably, began to wonder what had been peculiar about this trip prior to the problem occurring. The first thing that was evident was that the aircraft's small turbine, located in the tail, known as the APU, had been running the entire time. Is it possible that the APU generator, or the APU itself, had failed? To find out, there was only one option. The captain turned off the APU and turned it back on. The pilots awaited the instruments in the cockpit to come back to life with apprehension as it spun up. However, that time never arrived. The APU wasn't the cause. Nothing the pilots tried seemed to be working. They were operating their aircraft manually, thousands of feet above the ocean, cut off from the outside world, and there was every chance that things would get worse very soon. What if the instruments of the first officer broke down? Then, how would they get to an airport? Or what if fighter jets were to intercept them? Pilots were confused. They were running out of options with every minute that went by. The lead flight attendant was summoned to the cockpit by the captain. He informed her that she would have to get the cabin ready for an emergency landing since there was an emergency. This was the first moment anyone in the aircraft's rear had any idea of what was happening. After going back to the passenger cabin, she gave the other crew members a briefing, after which they started getting the passengers ready for the emergency landing. Now, the pilots needed to make a crucial choice. Should they veer off course and go somewhere nearby? Or should they still go to Bristol, which was their initial destination? Would it be stupid to go all the way to Bristol when there were closer options, considering the seriousness of their circumstances and the likelihood that things could get worse at any time? However, the pilots were aware that fighter jets would perceive their deviation from the intended trajectory as a hostile act. It it would be extremely difficult for the pilots to explain what they were doing without a functional radio. They risked having their aircraft shot down if they veered off track. Fighter jets might still intercept them if they stuck to their intended course to Bristol, but the likelihood of that happening was significantly reduced as long as they flew steadily along their original route. Very probable they would be hit by gunfire. The pilots reasoned that since they already had the airport's meteorological information, there was yet further benefit to continue to Bristol. They wouldn't be able to obtain weather reports for any other airports if they had no means of communication with the outside world. The captain considered his alternatives and concluded that it would be best to continue on to Bristol. This meant that the plane would be in the air for a longer period of time, but at least it would give the outside world some indication of the plane's progress. However, the crew's issues weren't resolved by this choice. Not at all, in fact. Considering the condition of the aircraft, it was impossible for the pilots to predict if they would be able to stop it on the runway. Among all international airports in the United Kingdom, Bristol Airport boasts one of the shortest runways. Would the airplane crash upon landing if other systems, such as the thrust reversers, spoilers, or flaps, had malfunctioned as well? Looking for the charts that indicated the stopping distance in various failure scenarios, the captain quickly skimmed through the aircraft's quick reference guide. The website he landed on displayed the emergency electrical configuration in numerical form. Though not exactly the same, he reasoned that it was a good enough representation. Based on the appearance, runway 09 at Bristol should provide them with sufficient stopping distance. The weather report also indicated to the captain that they would probably find the runway at Bristol dry when they got there, which increased the likelihood of actually stopping on it. Thus, a decision was made. At Bristol, the crew would be trying to land their damaged aircraft. Proceeding, the captain entered the arrival path into the flight management computer of the first officer. He entered Bristol's runway 09 by one of the usual routes. Air traffic controllers would be able to forecast the plane's behavior in this manner, making the journey seem less dangerous. Once everything was in place, the first officer started to descend. He would have found the experience of hand-flying the fall from 32,000 feet to be quite unusual. Pilots typically operate manually in the final minutes before landing and at the start of the flight, but they hardly ever operate manually at cruising altitude. Still, it was a simple assignment for the first officer. As a team, he and the captain were performing exceptionally well. The way the captain was allocating the task ensured that none of the pilots felt overburdened. However, the pilots realized as they dropped that their true worries remained ahead of them. The sense of duty was immense because there were 142 individuals in the back of the plane. The first cop started to feel chilly and dizzy as the minutes passed. This was a worrying turn of events. These two were signs of hypoxia. Is there a depressurizer on the plane? The pilots debated whether to put on their breathing masks, but ultimately opted not to. They would find it more difficult to converse with one another because of this, and they would also be at a breathing altitude in a matter of minutes. Controllers in London followed the silent descent of the jet. They thought the battle was still going down toward Bristol, where it had started. Not in radio contact, they informed Bristol Air Traffic Control that a plane was in descent over the southern coast of England. It should be landing in Bristol in a few minutes if it was flying according to plan. Bristol controllers took prompt action. At the airport, they proclaimed a complete emergency. Fearing the worst, fire departments and ambulances raced to the runway. As the quiet jet approached, all departures and arrivals at the airport were halted. The pilots had a moment of truth when they returned to the cockpit. They were going to test the effectiveness of their flaps, which would be essential for reducing the plane's speed in preparation for landing. They made the decision to find out as soon as possible, while they still had time to make preparations, if they would be landing without flaps. Thus, the skipper set the flap lever to the first position at around 20 past 12 local time. The two pilots did not breathe. As expected, though, their instruments informed them that the flaps had been effectively deployed in a matter of seconds. Their prospects had significantly improved. By pulling the flaps more apart, they would have ample time to stop on the runway if they could land at their typical landing speed. But before landing, the crew had other things to stretch besides the flaps. What about the actual landing gear? The pilots waited while the captain depressed the landing gear lever. However, there was no typical clunk of the gear expanding, and neither did the lights turn green, as they should have when the gears expanded. The pilots really didn't need this. There was a very real danger that the flight would finish in a conflagration if they had to ground their plane on its engines. In the airport, emergency services and the tower controller were unaware of this. They had their eyes fixed on the airport, watching the craft via binoculars as it got closer, unsure of what kind of emergency the flight was experiencing. It was somewhere above France, the last time it had been in contact with the outside world. However, similar to any passenger aircraft, there were multiple methods available for lowering the landing gear. A manual gravity gear extension mechanism on the A319 enables the gear to extend under its own weight. The skipper reached for this system's handle and turned the lever until the doors opened, and the gear gradually slid into position. The aircraft was finally ready for landing. It was now the first officer's responsibility to get it onto the runway and stop it. The pilots had no intention of taking any chances. They decided that the first officer would apply full reverse thrust to the engines and slam on the brakes as soon as the wheels touched the runway. The passengers were unsure of what to anticipate in the cabin. The captain tried desperately to make contact with the ground as the first officer plummeted towards the runway. He pulled out his cell phone and attempted to dial Bristol air traffic control. However, he was still unable to receive a signal at this low altitude. He tried again, using the first officer's phone, frustrated. However, there was still no signal, and that was all. The crew had exhausted all options for communicating with the ground. Bristol would be their landing port, and they'd be landing without approval for the first time in their lives. The automated voice in the cockpit announced the plane's altitude above the Earth as it got closer to the runway. As soon as the aircraft landed, the first officer applied the brakes firmly. With a roar, the engines engaged in full reverse thrust. The plane had crawled to a stop on the runway in a matter of moments. Every one of the 144 passengers and crew had made it safely to the ground after an amazing and strange experience. The pilots were still confused, though. What might have happened to cause their brand new, cutting-edge jet to lose electrical power so catastrophically? And why hadn't the electricity been restored using their checklist? It came out that every other system that depended on the primary electrical bus had been shut down when a defective electrical contact deep inside one of the aircraft's transformers sensed a current flow when there wasn't actually any. This was a serious electrical malfunction that might recur if Airbus couldn't increase the redundancy of their systems. Because of this, the final report suggested
that Airbus upgrade its software. It would stop the aircraft's computers from misinterpreting stray electrical currents. The inquiry was at a loss as to why the checklist was unable to restart the aircraft's electrical system. Once the aircraft was back on the ground, they tested it and were unable to reproduce the problem. The captain pressed the appropriate push button, and they were unable to figure out why the power didn't go to the operational system. However, in the wake of this occurrence, Airbus implemented certain major modifications that have significantly reduced the likelihood of a similar incident in the future. For starters, the aircraft's radios can no longer be rendered inoperable by the loss of a single bus bar, which is the electrified metal rod from which the aircraft gets its electricity. If a comparable power outage happened today, the full radio failure that the pilots of aircraft 6074 encountered would not happen because to this additional layer of redundancy. Another improvement made by Airbus is that power is now automatically transferred from the malfunctioning system to the operational system instead than being done by the pilots. This shortens the period of time between the occurrence of a fault and its correction. It also eliminates the chance of human error occurring within the loop. Ultimately, there was a compelling argument against the aircraft's push-button design in the incident report. It said that one of a selector's fundamental duties, which is to consistently give a dependable, prompt, and obvious indicator of its selection, is absent from these push buttons. The research suggested that manufacturers provide pilots with a simpler way to determine which position their switches are in dot, in order to avoid any doubt as to whether they are in the position of selection or deselection. Even in 2006, modern aviation systems were far less redundant and safer than they were now, thanks to these crucial lessons. Nonetheless, the pilot's expertise and cooperation during the incident remained a crucial aspect of the overall safety picture. Previous aircraft downings were caused by pilot mishandling of far smaller problems than this one. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.